New America would like to welcome you to our virtual event. The program will begin momentarily. While we are waiting, I want to review a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded, and a recording will be posted to the New America events page within 48 hours after the event. Attendees will be in listen-only mode, and you will not be able to be seen or heard by your fellow attendees or panelists. Therefore, we encourage you to share your comments and questions in the Slido box located to the right of the video. Closed captioning is available by hovering over the video and clicking CC at the bottom of the video. If you encounter any issues during the event, please contact events@newamerica.org. Thank you for joining us. We will begin momentarily.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this Future Tense event titled, Is China Canceling the Internet? I'm Andres Martinez. I'm the editorial director of Future Tense and a professor of practice at Arizona State University's School of Journalism, the Walter Cronkite School. Future Tense, for those of you who haven't been with us before, is a partnership between Arizona State University, New America, and Slate Magazine, and we explore the impact of technology on society. And I'm really thrilled for today's conversation, which is so timely and so aligned with the things that we're curious about at Future Tense. And we have two wonderful experts to learn from today. Both happen to be former New America fellows, so it feels like we're all in the family here. Yiling Yu is based in Beijing, and so extra thanks for waking up early where you are to join this conversation. Yiling is a writer based there who is working on narrative nonfiction book about the internet in China and has done fantastic reporting for all sorts of publications, The Economist, The New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, Wired, looking at this interplay of technology, society in China and the internet in particular. So we're really thrilled and lucky to have you. And Daniel Kurtz-Phelan is the editor of Foreign Affairs Magazine, former policy analyst in the State Department Office of the Policy Planning Staff. And during his New America Fellowship and subsequently, he published an amazing book called The China Mission, which is one of my favorite books from pre-pandemic times, which looked at the George Marshall diplomatic mission in China. And it's amazing history, and it reads like great fiction. And then I just have to point out that I have the magazine here, your latest issue, which has a lot of great content related to what we're going to be talking about today. And I always carry this around because it just gives me some gravitas that I otherwise don't have. Although the writing, I'm sorry, I was wondering if I was frozen. Apologies in advance if we do have some tech issues. We're all zooming in from different places, and it's amazing what this technology allows us to do, as we all know, and as we've all become accustomed to. Sometimes, we're still relying on Wi-Fi. And I was worried. I'm in Mexico City today. Yiling's in Beijing. It looks like Dan is a little bit frozen right now, even though he should have no excuse because he's in the U.S. But anyways, let's get started. Dan, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. So, we were a little bit playful in this title of Is China Canceling the Internet? But I liked the idea that what we want to be talking about is sort of at the macro level, kind of, there's a lot of talk in places like Washington, particularly in Washington, about national competitiveness and, tech powers, and it even encroaches upon domestic policy. You have this sort of discourse in DC that, we have to be careful how we regulate the likes of Facebook and Google and our tech giants because, we need our tech titans to go up against, our Chinese competitors, right? And that this is an argument that I think Silicon Valley has gotten a lot of mileage out of, and people are very worried about competitiveness on, AI or, the race to 5G. You name the technology. There are people who want to sort of treat this as a contest, right, between these two great tech powers. On the other hand, I also want this conversation to really get beyond that sort of abstract macro, geostrategic talk and look at how people, really experience the internet and the sort of online culture, and whether all of this noise about what may or may not be happening in China or is happening, but how it translates down to sort of like the user's experience and the online community. And because sometimes I don't really have a good handle on that. I can read headlines about Jack Ma and Alibaba, or this particular race on what's happening in a particular technology, but I don't really, Yiling, I'm really going to look to you to understand, how different is the internet experience in China today than it was, a couple of years ago with all of this. And the other part of this is, I'll just throw this out and then we can get into the conversation and hear from you, is, and this sounds a bit silly, but is China canceling the internet? The other reason it's sort of playful is the internet in some ways seems like it's bigger in China. And that might be sort of a very simplistic thing to say. But when I read some of the profiles that you've done, Yiling, about celebrities online and the fan culture, and also the way in which technology was able to allow an economy to sort of catapult past certain stages that we had gone through in the U.S. And I feel like in China, at the risk of overgeneralizing, but payment systems and the way in which the social media was integrated with retail earlier, all of that seems and you can push back if I'm wrong, but like more advanced in China. And certainly like the relationship that these streamers have with the public. Hao Wu is another former New America Fellow, and we did a future tense screening of the People's Republic of Desire, and when you watch that movie, that's a little bit what I mean about, wow, the internet is bigger of some of the ground rules, in a regime that, again, knows something about canceling people or, issues, actions, call it what you might. So that's kind of how we wanted to get into this, to think about, taking a lot of the background context and the big, macro stories that future tense readers might be familiar with, and kind of being like, okay, but what's really actually happening? So Dan, let me start off on the sort of macro national competitiveness. I mean, your latest issue has some really provocative pieces on how we should think about, the relationship with China, analogies and distinctions with the old Cold War with the Soviet Union. There's an interesting article by Bremer talking about, the sort of the tech competition, but also the fact that we have some of these tech companies are now supranational. And I guess that's maybe one of the tensions that occurs in China, where maybe the government felt like, well, we can't allow that to happen. Whereas in the US, the discourse is like, let's not rein this in because we don't want, we need to keep up with the Chinese companies. But, help us frame kind of, before we get into the nitty gritty of what's happening on the internet in China, what's happening in the sort of politics in China in terms of, is there kind of a rethink of some of the liberalization of the last few decades that allowed for the growth of tech companies that looked and seemed very much like our tech companies, but also they might have afforded people a lot of more autonomy in daily life, in their economic life, and also in maybe like the way they connected with each other online?
Yeah, well, thanks, Andres, and it's great to be back at New America. It was a really wonderful place to spend time writing my book, and for all the fellows who have come through, it's kind of provides a really unique platform for just kind of spending time and really kind of getting into something seriously as you're trying to write a book. So I'm happy to be back. I think we may see between our various freezing Zoom screens a version of tech competition playing out here, and we can see whether New York City or Beijing or Mexico City proves to be able to handle this relatively simple task before we get into quantum computing and AI and biotech and all that. But I think one thing that's you see a lot of as you say, Andres, really kind of abstract discussion of tech competition and who's ahead in the tech race in various ways, and how each society is dealing with tech issues. And I'm excited to hear from Yiling and read her book when it's out, because we, I think too rarely here get really a kind of textured, empirical, ground up view of that from China. And there are reasons why that's, I think, becoming harder in the geopolitics and diplomacy, and obviously COVID has something to do with this. But the kind of much more textured and less geopolitically or ideologically driven view is especially valuable. So I'm looking forward to hearing that. But let me try to step back a bit and give some context on the kind of US-China relationship, which, as I'm sure everyone here knows, is at a rather fraught and changing moment. But then also on where things stand in China and how this kind of fits into some of the imperatives there. And I think what is so fascinating and complicated about this set of questions is that both for the relationship that wraps in all these incredibly complicated dynamics, and then also for each society and leaders in each society, we all know that we are wrestling with the same set of questions about the role of tech in society and how platforms are regulated and all those questions. So it wraps together the kind of domestic and the geopolitical in really fascinating ways. When you look at this moment in China, especially for Xi Jinping, who's at this real moment of kind of both kind of sensitivity, but also consolidation of power. You've seen a number of steps, not just within the tech space over the last several years, which are really about stamping out rivals and cementing his power, and reversing some of the openness that had come to China over the previous decades. Some of that is about the lead up to the National Party Congress next November, which is a moment when Xi Jinping is aiming to start a third term, people think, and kind of busting through a norm on term limits that have been in place. There's everything from the recent resolution on history, of kind of elevating him into the kind of pantheon of Chinese Communist Party leaders. There's a whole host of things that really make this a kind of challenging and interesting moment for him. And this intersects with tech in a slew of ways. Some of this is about going after tycoons who are outspoken, who may see themselves as a kind of alternate power center, or who senior CCP leadership sees as an alternative power center. Some of it is about the relationship between kind of tech and political action. There's been, I think, over time, in future tense, has been an important part of this debate at various points. Is are various forms of technology going to favor democratization, favor ground up pressure in civil society, or are they going to be tools of surveillance and authoritarian control? And that's a very live question, obviously, if you're sitting in a government building or a kind of security office in Beijing. So there is that dimension of it. And then, I think it's also worth saying that China is reckoning with a lot of the things that we are reckoning with here when it comes to everything from children and screen time to economic issues and inequality, to how platforms interact with other parts of business society. So there's this really kind of fascinating, complicated swirl. And then of course you have the whole geopolitical dimension and the fact of US-China competition, which has made technology one of the kind of central playing fields, central arenas for this competition. I think you had the USCI director talking about it as a main arena for competition and rivalry between China and the US. You had Xi Jinping talking about technological innovation as one of the main battlegrounds of the global playing field. So you have both sides who see it that way. And that again also plays out in a whole whole host of different arenas, and that's everything from the race to be ahead in 5G or quantum computing and AI. It's about supply chains, and there's obviously been in the U.S. a push to kind of crack down on the access of Chinese companies to U.S. technology and supplies. And then there's also, the question of kind of international standards and how each government is interacting with international bodies, formal and informal, that are trying to set international standards on tech. So that's obviously a complicated set of considerations. And the fact of growing tension in the U.S.-China relationship makes all of them more complicated to deal with. So I will leave it there and turn to Yiling for, I suppose, more texture on the crackdown and what that actually looks like from the ground in Beijing. So I think we've lost Andres momentarily. Is that, Yiling, do you see him anywhere?
I don't see him.
No, Andres. Okay.
I can just speak to some of the things you're saying, and how some of the changes are being felt on ground. One thing that I would say, just from a bigger kind of bird's eye view before zooming in, is that Andreas is back potentially, but I'll just continue. I think that actually there's something a little bigger taking place behind the crackdown on the internet, and I think that will help us contextualize what's taking place on the ground, which is, I do feel like what has been taking place in the last year in China, really starting from Jack Ma's kind of fall from grace after the Ant IPO was canceled, is a kind of aggressive reining in of all the excesses of, I think, what China perceives to be as neoliberalism, effectively, in the sense that when we look at something like the crackdown on, for example, education technology companies, that's a very kind of multi-pronged story that doesn't just have to do with ed tech, right? I think on one hand, it has to do with the fact that it wants to rein in a internet company like New Oriental, which has done immensely well in China over the last decade. On the other hand, I think the crackdown on after-school tutoring has much more to do with the fact that people are burnt out, and that the government can see this kind of extreme inequality within the education system. Even Xi Jinping, in his kind of common prosperity speech, where he said, we're done with letting some people get rich first. Now we're going to kind of bring about common prosperity. A big part of it is what he called involution, right? Which was a word that sprouted on the online internet, where a lot of kind of Chinese people were basically complaining about this kind of excessive competition and burnout that was driving them towards growth with no kind of spiritual meaning or purpose. And so this viral, obscure word from like scholarly anthropology finally got picked up in Xi Jinping's speech. And so a lot of the kind of crackdowns are designed to address that. And with the education piece, there's also the kind of ideological piece, right? A lot of it has been, or a part of it has been about kind of banning foreign teachers and kind of steering away foreign influence. And so that's one part of it as well. Not to mention demographics, right? This kind of like shrinking, aging population. A lot of people don't necessarily see how a crackdown on tutoring has anything to do with demographics, but there's a huge linkage there in the sense that Chinese people increasingly so don't want to have babies, not one, not to mention three, which is kind of what the government is aggressively pushing now. And a huge part of it is that babies are expensive. And the average Chinese person spends like up to half their income on their kids' like education and tutoring fees. And so a lot of this crackdown is about getting Chinese parents to start having children again. And so I guess the broader point I'm trying to make here is that, when we see something like New Oriental, first education company to do its IPO in the New York Stock Exchange, like plummets, and, the whole company is falling apart and swerves to selling vegetables. There have been a whole kind of series of factors that have been, in the making for a long time, that have kind of made the final push for the government to introduce, such a regulation among a whole slew of other ones. And so I guess that's kind of one point that I would make. It's Andreas. There.
Andreas, are you back?
Can you hear me? And
yeah.
Yes.
The contest and the I think Mexico City is seriously blowing it here. It's the tech contest here. But I was listening, and that was super interesting. And Yiling, I think it's a good reminder to focus on the fact that this is not just happening in terms of the consumer internet, but it's happening across a broader swath of activities. Given what's happened in the last few weeks, I did want to ask about the case of Peng Shuai, the tennis player, and that's really, I think, captured a lot of people's imagination and attention, and we saw what the reaction of the World Tennis Association. But in terms of the censorship angle and the way in which people online relate to a story like that, how has that episode played into the trends that we've seen recently, or is it just somewhat separate in the sense that it could have happened 5 years ago? Or I'm just curious for like your reaction in terms of how you've seen this story play out, perhaps in our media that might be missing something or might be different from what you're seeing on the ground.
Yeah. To be honest, I think, what makes the Peng Shuai case so fascinating is, that it has kind of implicated the kind of highest levels of leadership, like, speaking out kind of against sexual harassment has been taking place for a while now, particularly after 2017, when the feminist movement and the Me Too movement started, kicking off here in China. But so the kind of most important and interesting part of it is that it is implicating higher levels of leadership. And then the second part I would say is interesting is that that the WTA is involved, right? And so that there is huge kind of international attention that is continuing to sustain itself, and it's going to, implicate the business world and the tennis community more broadly. But like, seeing how things are taking place here, it very much feels like the censorship machine is just going into its usual mode. Like, it's just playing out what it always does, maybe a little bit more effectively and kind of more quickly than it would have a decade ago or even 5 years ago. But it almost feels like, it just feels like business as usual. Like, the thing goes up, it goes up for 20 minutes, then it's scrubbed off all platforms, then all the keywords are kind of aggressively taken down. Everything from, like, it's not just like her name, like Peng Shuai and Zhang Gaoli. It's like, you'll have like a cat and mouse game of like users putting down words like Mike Pence and Serena Williams, or like the Prime Minister and I, which is like a Korean, TV drama, and like all of that, all related words, tennis,
Right.
Will just be taken down. And it's very kind of sweeping and aggressive, but it kind of works. Like, it, at least domestically, right? It disappears from the public conversation. Like, it's around, floating around, people are talking about it. And then after a while, public amnesia settles in pretty quickly, and the moment passes, at least domestically. I think the challenge here, and where that model of censorship just does not work as well, is in the international kind of community, right? Outside the firewall. That kind of like, okay, we're just going to forget it all happened, just simply does not work. And so the approach there is kind of this, like, and I think that's what's a little new, right? Is this kind of like the presence of like state media, like Global Times' Hu Xijin, like saying, well, she's totally fine, right? And like putting out these videos of her like having dinner with her friends. And so that feels a lot clumsier and like ineffective, but it seems like they just don't really have any idea how to deal with it on a kind of international stage. But, and I think domestically, it definitely feels like that's just how things have been dealt with for a while.
Right. And I guess if I'm, President Xi Jinping or from the Chinese government's position, I would imagine that the reason why this case is doubly fraught is it's coming on the eve of the Winter Olympics. I mean, pretty much that's going to be here before we know it, right, in February. So in terms of the interplay between the domestic scene and this international realm where it's harder to control, as you've mentioned, this is very inconvenient timing for a case like this to break for the government, and there probably already was a fair amount of concern about international media or potential for activism around the Olympics, which can be tampened down to some extent by the pandemic and the controls adjacent to that. But when you look forward to the Olympics as a flashpoint, is there, how does this case play into that, and what do you expect that we might see or not see around the Olympics in terms of people, dissent or activism? Some of it may be imported to the extent that one can during a pandemic when they're not allowing a lot of international visitors.
I don't foresee any kind of huge changes from I certainly don't foresee any type of dissent and activism, particularly not from on the ground. But I do think that there will be like a huge kind of ramping up of security. I think that, censors will go into overdrive. Everything will be sensitive. But, I think the Winter Olympics in some ways is just like another just like scaled up version of an important event. And what happens during important events is things get scrubbed off a little more kind of aggressively, and people who are perceived as kind of like threats will be silenced. And so I don't think that there is anything particularly special about the Winter Olympics other than that it is an important event and they will do what takes place around important events. Yeah.
Andres, can I ask Yiling a question about the way the diplomatic boycott is being discussed there? I mean, to what extent has there been a decision to make that a major topic of conversation, and how is that being talked about? From the external messaging of Chinese government officials, there seem very happy to point out how few countries have so far joined with the U.S. and in the boycott so far. But I imagine that is also an opportunity to push a certain message domestically. So I'm really curious how that looks from your vantage there.
Yeah. I mean, so far, not really discussed it. I have to like discuss with people more, but it isn't this kind of like huge inflammatory subject that people are enraged about. It's kind of almost just like a side note. Maybe I'm not an athlete or I'm not like deep in the athletics kind of circle, but I mean, I think that the messaging that at least Chinese diplomats are putting out and kind of Chinese state media is putting out does seem to echo to a certain extent the sentiment that is on the ground, which is, I mean, there's a pretty funny tweet that someone put out recently where one of the kind of state media folks was like, in this almost like childish, like spurned, like teenage lover voice, was just like, well, we didn't invite you anyway. And the tweet was something like, this has a I didn't break up with you, or you didn't break up with me, I broke up with you vibes. And so I do think that it sends important messaging kind of internationally and to the international community, though I don't know to what extent like it is really kind of felt or discussed in any great depth domestically.
Thank you. I just want to remind our audience too that we'd love to have questions from all of you. I see I think a couple have come in, but you can pose a question in the slide box to the right of the video. So please chime in. Dan, I wanted to ask you something quickly about this. I hear from Yiling that there's actually a fair amount of continuity here, and the Chinese government's ability to control the message and to police what is being talked about online in cases like this, remains pretty formidable, regardless of what we might think. But when she also mentioned the more difficult challenge that maybe they're not as successful in terms of the international dynamic, and related to that, I'm wondering if you think that we're just going to see it's increasingly difficult for Western multinationals to be in China, right? On the one hand, we're incredibly, the supply chain is there. It's been tried recently, but our economies are so tightly intertwined, and yet on the other hand, particularly in the tech space, you've seen a lot of companies withdraw. I think LinkedIn was a prominent company that, platform that decided that it couldn't do it. I mean, the Google saga about whether to be in China or not, given like the what you have to do to be there is a long story that goes way back. So we've seen this sort of, part of the narrative up until this recent crackdown was that China was going to have its formidable text-based internet that was going to be sort of parallel to ours, right behind this firewall. But in terms of like other brands that are more, consumer brands, like, the Nikes and the Coca-Colas of the world, I mean, obviously those companies are very much still present in China. There have been pressure on them at times, and even congressional hearings about, well, are you, what are your facilities in Western China? And are, the questions about potential prison labor, or as consumer activism increases and there's awareness on certain human rights issues, there might be more pressure borne on entities to withdraw. I mean, the World Tennis Association, I guess, would be an example of this, right? So that kind of activism might be present in and around the Olympics, right? The sponsors and just going forward, like, do you think that this might be part of a decoupling that might occur in terms of our very close ties with China, that's less about at the government level, and how that might percolate into worsening ties if we just become more and more divorced in terms of like our brands in the tech space, but elsewhere as well.
It's a great and big question. I mean, in some ways, I think the kind of dynamics around decoupling, and this became in some ways a dimension of official U.S. policy, and the word kind of came into common usage during the Trump administration. I think the dynamics had been at play for several years before that, and they were driven by imperatives on both sides, right? Both in the U.S. and China. Xi Jinping several years ago started talking about Made in China 2025 and driving self-sufficiency in a whole slew of sectors, including many tech sectors. The attempts to limit, I think quite successfully, though not completely, what most Chinese users of the internet can see and what they consume about scandals that might seem to be getting a lot of play in foreign press, but be getting much less attention for the average Chinese reader. On the U.S. side, you had all the tech companies you mentioned struggling to figure out how to operate in both markets and address the kinds of pressures they were going to get from either consumers or regulators in the US or other Western markets with the demands that they were facing in China. So all of those dynamics were playing out even before you saw decoupling becoming a much more kind of official part of US policy in the Trump years. And I think you have, again, a kind of set of dynamics that are in some ways pushing in other directions. So there's clearly going to be some continuing degree of this kind of divide in sectors that are deemed sensitive by one side or the other for one reason or another. You're also going to see more and more companies just struggling to, balance those two imperatives, and that's true tech, most notably. But you see, Ray Dalio, for example, raised a big new China fund recently, and he's had to answer questions about the Uyghurs and about Hong Kong and about a variety of other human rights issues that I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, if you were a big investor, you just wouldn't have been. He's tried to say, look, that's not my business or expertise, but that's not really an answer that in the U.S. context you're able to get away with in the same way. And similarly, if you're a clothing manufacturer or an advertiser, you similarly kind of have to have something to say about supply chains in Xinjiang or other issues that are of increasing salience. Hollywood would be another example where China is an incredibly important market to Hollywood studios, and they've been trying very hard to get in. But you have kind of growing attention on some of the self-censorship that Hollywood has resorted to in order to find inroads into the market. So you have it within the tech space, but then also much more broadly. And then, probably most, I don't know if it's most consequential, but quite consequentially also on the kind of people-to-people level. For a long time, there was I think a pretty deliberate attempt to really promote lots of people-to-people interaction and to encourage the, flow of students back and forth. And that has gotten caught up in this swirl of, security concerns and, speculation about whether there are, kind of Chinese spies hiding in graduate departments, right, and concerns about, Chinese American researchers. And you can, surely there are some valid concerns there, but as that plays out on the ground, it kind of goes to an extreme very, very quickly. And I think tends to get caught up in a swirl of kind of panicked reactions, and all of that is again just going to kind of reinforce these dynamics on both sides. And obviously the pandemic and the fact that there's been very little travel, and especially with China, which it's worth saying is committed to a strategy that has been very effective, but also doesn't offer a clear kind of roadmap out of the pandemic that we're all still struggling with in different ways right now. So that in the as these geopolitical dynamics play out makes it much harder, I think, for both sides to have a real sense of what others are thinking. And certainly at the diplomatic level, you would have much more in the way of exchanges and really kind of serious substantive exchange 5 or 7 years ago, both official and kind of semi-official, and a lot of that has slowed down quite a bit, which just reinforces misperception and miscalculation, whatever else.
Yeah, and as you know, that's an issue of interest and importance to us at Arizona State, where we have thousands of Chinese students, and we obviously as part of our mission, and selfishly, I guess people could point out, as part of our overall health of the institution, having those exchanges and having international students is really important. And you've had a global pandemic and this sort of changing tenor of foreign policy, national security talk affect that in some ways. And that reminds me, I was curious that your latest issue of Foreign Affairs also has this poll, the back page, where you asked dozens of experts whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement that we've become too hostile to China. What's really interesting about the results is it seems, just eyeballing here, pretty evenly divided with experts. I guess like 50, 60 experts were asked, something in that ballpark, and it's pretty evenly divided. And I know a couple of years ago, you and I were at dinner with President Crow of ASU, and a couple of people in the room, and I think including President Crow, felt that Washington had become too enamored of the sort of Cold War framing network, and that maybe a lot of people, more people in the room then, might have said we were being too hostile. But I suppose recent events might have been giving some ammunition or debating points to people who feel like we need to be more sterner, hawkish towards China. But then you get into the debates about, well, how is this a self-fulfilling prophecy, and who's reacting to whose rhetoric? And I don't expect you to have like a definitive take, but I'm just throwing it out there.
No, I mean, I was thinking about that event we did with Michael Crow, the president of Arizona State, who I think said fairly crisply, look, a couple of years ago, the U.S. government was encouraging me to, open a Chinese language center on campus and bring as many students in as possible. And now, it's like I get threatening letters from the Department of Defense telling me I'm going to lose, funding for things if we don't, track these things more carefully, which I think just indicates how dramatic and marked that shift was in a very short amount of time. And I think what is really striking about this poll that is in our current issue and on our website, you can kind of see the full breakdown of all these answers. It followed when we did in 2018 or 2019, asking respondents whether Chinese and American national interests were incompatible. And not getting at the foreign policy question, but at this kind of core interest question. And I think what is really striking to me about both these is that while there's really wide variation and, people on who argue very vehemently and with, high degree of confidence that U.S. policy has become too hostile to China or vice versa, it is not hostile enough, that it really does not break down politically or ideologically among the American respondents in an obvious way. So you have people who, are kind of traditionally associated with the kind of, human rights left, who are much more focused on Hong Kong or speech issues or Uyghurs who have been part of this turn. You also have kind of more traditional defense hawks. And on the flip side, you have kind of progressives who are concerned about a new kind of hardline approach in national security. You have kind of people on the right who really just want a degree of restraint in American foreign policy. So it's been, I think, kind of scrambled the politics on the U.S. side in interesting ways. Not to mention there are certainly versions of this debate playing out within China as well. So I think it's the new paradigm is still kind of trying to be defined. And I think part of what we were trying to get at in this recent issue was this idea that we kind of fall back into these Cold War habits. It wasn't meant to be kind of endorsement of the Cold War, but an exploration of those dynamics and how we get into them. And because that, I think, is the kind of muscle memory for lots of people in the U.S. foreign policy world, that kind of tends to become the framework through which people see things.
And it is interesting how, in contrast to the Cold War years with the Soviets, I mean, this really is often driven by concerns about technological advantage. I mean, I was in college back in the Reagan Gorbachev years, and nobody was worried that the Soviet Union was going to sort of outdo the West when it came to technologies. It was the concern was it was just like raw military, territorial issues, and not oh my gosh, they're going to outpace us when it comes to artificial intelligence or synthetic biology or the things that we talk about in this contest with China, in addition to what does feel like a more traditional geopolitical contest. But Yiling, I do want us to get back to China and back online. We used to talk about like, how does this affect people on the street? Like, I want to know how this affects people online, because you were talking about what we've seen in terms of the changing official attitudes and relationship towards the Alibabas of the world, the online education space that you talked about. We know about the cancellation of the Ant Group IPO that was related to Alibaba. But getting beyond that, more down to the level of, Liu Mama, who I think was the name of the person you profiled in that great New Yorker piece. I think the headline, I'm looking at the title, Liu Mama's Everyday Life. And this was a farmer, a peasant who was streaming, right, and became this internet sensation. And I think there was this term that you used in the article about broadcast jockeys, and there was a sense that you could have quite celebrityhood and success, and which would translate into commercial success online, and people could connect and have these communities. And this was also the subject of Hao Wu's film. And I wonder if that kind of more grassroots, if it's the right term, but spontaneous coming together online around, non-political issues like that. If that's changed at all, if there's any kind of dampening of that energy on the Chinese internet, regardless of what's happening politically between, Tencent and Alibaba and the Chinese government, like is that trickling down to that kind of ability for us to go online and create community?
Definitely. I mean, I think the way that I would frame it is, how kind of the bigger picture has kind of trickled down into everyday life, and in this specific example, online celebrity or kind of like online influence. I've started to think of the kind of developmental trajectory of the Chinese internet in kind of three phases. And so if we think about kind of pre 2013, or more kind of like the heady kind of period of the Olympics, very optimistic, relatively open. Before that, I think of the Chinese internet very much so, aside from kind of like a bare bones firewall, with the same optimism as the global net, right? There's this idea that this was a town hall. Weibo, very much like Twitter, was going to like spark a information revolution. People were kind of speaking truth to power. There was a massive train crash in Wenzhou in 2011, and suddenly you have citizen journalists flocking to the scene. Very much kind of like relatively under-regulated, kind of lots of diverse voices on the field, and overwhelmingly liberal. So a lot of the kind of influencers of that time were very liberal, kind of like writers who were finally finding the internet as this kind of space they could express themselves. I think a big turning point to, I think what we see as the Leo Mama kind of period was 2013, where the government appointed this guy called Liu Wei as the head of the cyberspace administration. And he used a phrase which I think really very much characterizes the internet that I know and that I've written about basically up until recently. I think that stage has ended, which is, he described it as a spiritual garden, kind of this garden, this walled garden where, inside lots of things can flourish as long as it's kind of carefully pruned on the outside of any type of foreign influence. And so this is kind of the internet as we've known it for, the last 5 or 6 years, where there's no Google, no Facebook, no Twitter. Like, international kind of tech companies have been kicked out one by one. But, not only have these copycats emerged, as they were called back in the day, but they've kind of taken on a life of their own. And so this is the Alibaba is kind of growing, the ByteDance is starting to form at this period. And, the idea that you can have a online life that is like extremely integrated into kind of offline presence. I think, Andreas, you were mentioning earlier, right? Like, does the internet seem almost bigger in China? I would say bigger in the sense that it's like so inextricably bound into everyday life, right? From the kind of leapfrogging of like online payments technology, and to like now the fact that everywhere I go, I need to show a health code, right? Like I can't go anywhere really without my phone. And so this is kind of the period where there is kind of like a lot of innovation and kind of like a great flowering of ideas, but within these very tightly bound constraints. I would say like that period has definitively maybe come to an end, particularly with the recent set of kind of regulatory policies, in that kind of the idea that it's not just kind of political sensitivity that is no longer okay. It's really kind of like excessive wealth, kind of spiritual pollution, and vulgarity. And so there's this like economic piece that's not okay. Like, if you're a celebrity that's like making too much money or flaunting your wealth, that is a no-no. And the other thing that is out is that has been previously perceived with a lot more kind of openness and tolerance is stuff like LGBT issues, like that used to be kind of like more of a freewheeling space on the internet. But recently, I think both as a kind of reaction to LGBT civil society groups and the fear of kind of formation, as well as maybe just like a more kind of conservative patriarchal take on what online space should look like. There's been a clamping down on that as well. And so this is the first time where I think it's not just about kind of like walling off like external influence, but also like the creation of a very kind of like conservative or much more conservative, much more kind of controlled ideological narrative. And so that's kind of the shift that I see taking place now. Just a quick note there, like I think a celebrity now who can thrive in this space is this woman called Li Ziqi, who's like viral both in China and across the world for farming, like for kind of like planting her own crops in the Sichuanese countryside. And because she speaks all the right buzzwords, common prosperity, rural revitalization, and she has recently done an interview with CCTV, the state media, where she said, what I'm going to do is influence youngsters away from being influencers, right? That's the energy of the moment.
That's fascinating.
Sorry, I went on along there.
No, that was fascinating, and that's what I was wondering about, and you've given us a really good understanding. Because the platform on which a lot of the streaming happened, my understanding is that it started as a gaming platform, and is it? I don't know how. Is it YY, but it's probably not pronounced that way.
Yeah, I mean, given how internet platforms are changing, like barely anyone uses YY now, right? That was like 2016, okay. And I watched Howie's brilliant documentary too. But now everyone's on Douyin or Kuaishou, and those were just burgeoning at that time. Douyin is ByteDance's.
So are they being? Are they waning in influence, or is it just that the content is changing? Like you said, you have to readjust your.
The content is changing. I think it speaks to ByteDance's kind of like political savviness and its ability to survive in this like extremely challenging environment. Like it's just split itself into two, right? It's like pull the Voldemort, and there's like Douyin and TikTok. But it's the content. It's increasingly patriotic. It's increasingly kind of clean. It's filled with what the government likes to call positive energy, Zhengnengliang, right? And so Liu Mama, like a crude farmer, like spitting dirty rhymes, like on video, not positive energy, right? And so you see her content become more like this, like wholesome cooking show. So yeah, that's kind of the shift that's taking place.
There is somebody wrote in sent a question. We touched upon this a little bit, but it's interesting and worth. So the question is, if the Chinese government wants to censor foreign influence and culture, why do they want to participate in the Olympics if it is such an international event? So what's your sense of that? Like if you're adverse to all these influences and want to retain strong control, aren't you sort of opening the Pandora's box, or is this just sort of a confidence that you can have it both ways? You can bring in the world through the Olympics and show what you want to show, but I think that's where the question is headed. Like, if you want to be so controlling, why would you want to host the Olympics?
Dan, do you want to speak on that?
I mean, I think there's a long, there's some great political science work. We ran a piece by Don Mercati and Bill Woolforth earlier this year about why authoritarian states have traditionally been really attached to the Olympics and seeing that as a means of kind of projecting power and pursuing I think great power revelry by other means was their phrase. And I think in China's case, it is a matter of wanting to have it both ways, and I think you see this in lots of other countries as well. There's a desire to project influence. It's not a matter of there's a kind of endless debate about the extent to which there is a China model that the state is trying to bring to other parts of the world, but there's certainly a really concerted influence, and this has been, a major part of Xi Jinping's foreign policy over the last several years to project economic and political power and in the region, military power through a variety of means. So if you look at, a lot of what the Chinese have done in international organizations, within UN organizations and others, Belt and Road, kind of huge investment initiative and infrastructure initiative that has, now spans much of the world. So there is this real desire to kind of project that power, and the Olympics is a kind of great way to highlight that, or has traditionally been. The 2008 Olympics, people might remember as this real kind of important, almost, it's pitched as almost this kind of coming out party for the new China. And so it is an opportunity to kind of show this model and show a degree of pride to the rest of the world. And, I think the question is, does the boycott and controversy over whether it's, over Peng Shuai or others, to what extent does that become the story, or is there still a kind of narratives that much of the world will see that will project this kind of pride and strength? I'm curious how that looks from your vantage sitting in Beijing, Yiling, but I think that's the kind of geopolitics of this question, at least.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I would say that it's not trying to kind of like censor foreign culture and influence kind of as a blanket, like all foreign culture and influence, like people are, listening to foreign music, consuming foreign brands, like at a kind of in ways that are unprecedented, right? I think specifically it's trying to curtail foreign influence that has any like potential to undermine its authority. And so if they think that the Olympics is something that won't, then it seems like as sports is allegedly this kind of ideologically agnostic ground, then that's why they are deciding to participate.
Oh, I love that phrase. Dan knows that I'm really interested into thinking about this, the impact of sport on society and politics. And I love that phrase that you just used, Yiling, about it being ostensibly ideologically agnostic, because ostensibly is a key word there too. We're almost out of time, unbelievably, because it's flown by, but I do want to just try to squeeze in one last question from Adam, sent in by Adam M, because this is really interesting. Given, and to both of you, whatever it elicits, given China's domestic control of their digital terrain, how or in what ways is China currently using the internet as a tool of statecraft internationally? Any thoughts on that?
I can answer it really, really quickly. I realize we don't have much time, but I think you see it in a, I think it's a really important to the projection of Chinese influence, and you see it in everything from, the fight over shaping tech standards, the export of surveillance technology, the fight over 5G and kind of semiconductor production, all of the ways in which this intersects with military power, right? So a lot of the questions about what would happen in the Taiwan Strait is really about technology in various ways. So you kind of see that run. I realize we could spend half an hour talking about each of those, but I think you see it running through lots of these different projections of power. And in some ways, this is a place where you see the US and China and others, Europe's a very important force in some of the tech regulation stuff, kind of trying to project these different visions and working very actively to, kind of sell different parts of the world on their, actual technology, their approach to standards, their approach to a lot of these key questions. So you see it as both a kind of tool, but also an arena.
Yeah, I agree with what Dan said, though. Only one thing I would add is just like in terms of shaping the narrative, like in terms of storytelling, which I think in comparison to some of the hardware is just a little less kind of sophisticated, right? It's just like state media on Twitter. And I do think it will become more sophisticated, but right, like as of now, like the narrative seems to be another way in which the internet is trying, they're using the internet as a form of statecraft.
Yeah, this is not exactly high tech, but it's where there was this fascinating white paper on democracy that that was put out by China in the context of the American Summit for Democracy. And it just is kind of amazing to see this, debate playing out both on, on Twitter, but also through this, kind of very traditional forum.
When I first read this question, in addition to, debates around things like Huawei and 5G standards, I was also thinking about the sort of, admittedly very, somewhat farcical debates we had around TikTok and its ownership, in farcical in the context of like the overwrought DC politics, but it did connect to the sort of I think anxiety that people outside of China might have at the prospect that that we might see more and more big consumer brands coming in from China and that becoming more of a two-way street than we're more accustomed to sort of the default shared tech platforms brands that being kind of ours being exported, to put it crudely, and lo and behold, suddenly all our teenagers were on a platform that was coming from China, and that just gave rise to all sorts of concerns, and some might have been a little bit overdone. But I wonder, Yiling, do you think we'll see more Chinese brands, platforms coming to our shores? Or I guess the question is, are we going to see a stifling of innovation as a result of the current situation, which is always the debate, we get in the States, like, don't over-regulate tech companies or this is all going to come to an end. And that's a very big question to end on, and we have about a minute. People go.
It's the million dollar question, and I always hesitate to prognosticate because we tend to be wrong. But I would say yes in terms of like hardware, yes in terms of what kind of trying to conceive as like useful growth. I think in terms of like semiconductors and batteries and like electric vehicles, I still foresee like a lot of innovation taking place. But if it's going to be like ByteDance 2.0, like, or the new social media platform, or like a fashion brand, or like like a film, I think I'm less inclined to think that something innovative and new will happen there.
Great. Dan, anything on this, or?
No, I will let Yiling have the last word on that.
Excellent. Well, apologies, I've kept you both a couple of minutes over. I would love to continue talking to you both for a couple of hours, but alas, we must let you go. And thank you everybody who's tuned into this. This is we appreciate your being here, and I apologize for our tech difficulties and my Wi-Fi in particular. I'm really glad that I was the person kicked off and not one of our indispensable experts. So, but really appreciate Yiling and Dan, you being with us, and we'll continue to follow your writings and publications, and can't wait to read your book, Yiling, and to read your reporting in the meantime.